Can you talk about your learning process? How do you learn? Do you read? Do you listen? Do you write? All of the above. Can you take us? Let's say discover a new method, a new topic, a new thing that you want to dive into. What's your process from start to finish, from the first time you hear about it until the day you're applying it with your athletes on the field?
It starts, like you said, with me seeing something or hearing about something or coming up with something. So in the beginning, it used to be a lot like, oh, you see something on Instagram. Okay, cool. Let me try to do the same thing. And then for me, it's always been, if I see something, I have to try it first. Like I am the biggest guinea pig on earth to myself. Like I'm basically a case study until the end of time. Like anything I can test on myself, I will test on myself. So that's always how it starts. So in the beginning, again, I'll find something on Instagram. I'll hear, I've heard something or yada yada, something of that sort. Then I start to play around with it. If in the beginning it feels like there could be some value, then I'm going to do further and further research into that topic. Like I said, I'll deep dive into that rabbit hole, try to find everything I could possibly find about that topic, and then implement it within my own training. As I implement it within my own training, generally I'll find certain restrictions, maybe pros, maybe cons to whatever I'm doing at that time. And then I'm starting to think, okay, but how would this apply to other people? Because even if something works fantastically for me, or it has no results, or it actually creates a decrease in performance, whatever, that's still one person. It's still a case study. So I can't really say anything about it, but I can still get a certain hunch about whether I think it might be valuable in the long run. Mm-hmm. So then what would happen next is I discuss it with some of my colleagues, my coworkers. I have one over here, Eddie. He's a total dipshit. Make sure you don't follow him on Instagram. I'm joking. It's at Profect Performance. He's a fantastic guy. He's one of my kind of like my sparring partners. Mm-hmm. So I have a couple of people like that, and we throw ideas back and forth. And we make sure we're really critical about each other and everything we're thinking. So we make sure we really hammer in and play devil's advocate. Then if I get through some of those tests, then I'm like, okay, now I feel like I can introduce it to some athletes in the first place. I'll introduce it to a couple athletes where I think it might be valuable. And then from there, it like naturally either grows within my set of athletes, or maybe it'll kind of fade into the background. That just depends on if I feel like it works with the athletes. So it starts off by me hearing something, reading about something, or seeing something, or maybe coming up with something on my own. Then I start playing around with myself. I bounce the ideas off of some other people that I respect and I think are going to really be critical about what I just told them. Mm-hmm. Then I start to throw it to some players or athletes that I feel might benefit from it. And then it goes to maybe the broader population of athletes. And for some tools, they might stick really well in some groups, and other tools, I mean, they might get thrown in the trash with another group of athletes, right? What could work for one might work horribly for another. But generally, time will tell. So to get you an idea, I have a pretty extensive weightlifting background, also working with weightlifters, but I've generally have, in my situations, felt that Olympic weightlifting isn't the most effective tool within pro team sports. However, I do see a lot of advantages in using some of the tools from weightlifting. So when I started working with basketball players, I started thinking like their body shapes just aren't made for doing certain movements. Like let's say they have limited front rack mobility and they're just cranking on the wrist in that catch position. I'm like, I don't like this, but I still want to get that peak power. I want to get that peak power during hip extension, knee extension, and ankle extension. How do I get there? It's like, okay, we can get a clean pull. A clean pull, although a lot simpler and less demanding than a power clean, for instance, still has a decent amount of time that you need to invest into teaching the movement if you want to get it done properly. And by that, I mean, I know a lot of coaches say they can coach them properly. Look in the mirror. I don't know about that. So the clean pull still has quite the technical demands. So then I was thinking, okay, what about a trap bar? Like what if I throw a trap bar around a basketball player? It's much more suitable. Like I generally will do trap bar deadlifts instead of straight bar deadlifts. So why not do a trap bar clean pull instead of a regular clean pull? So then I start playing around with it myself. You know, you got force plates, You got gym awareness. You can try to see whether the peak power is similar, peak velocity is similar, whether the intent is similar, and whether maybe you can get the athletes to do it within 2 sessions instead of 15, right? Mm-hmm. So that's like kind of how I go through the process of like thinking, okay, I have a problem, right? A specific problem. I need a specific solution. And then I come up with something. I play around with it first, bounce the ideas off, implement it with some athletes, and the trap bar clean pull has been in there since then. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I go through it.
I'm 100% with you on what you described in terms of the time efficiency of learning just the trap bar jump versus the clean pull, especially if they don't have any background in that sport. And then would you mind sharing some of the numbers that you found playing with those two movements and comparing them from, a velocity standpoint? Did you find comparable metrics there?
Yeah, super comparable. There could, of course, if you have the power clean, generally compared to a pull, you're going to see higher velocities, higher peak powers, due to the athlete generating more intent of getting the bar to a higher level. Mm-hmm. But I didn't really see any noticeable differences between trap bar clean pulls and straight bar clean pulls. And that's really the comparable exercise you can make there, of course.
Besides that one practical example, could you think of the most useful tool that you've kind of unearthed through your process of learning and diving into those different rabbit holes? What's the one that you've come back with that you use now maybe every day or, regularly, and that you're like, oh, I'm glad I found this one, or I wish I would have found it earlier?
You mean training tools or
training tool, method, anything that you've added along the way that you wish you maybe had earlier on because of how valuable it is?
Jeez. The trap bar clean pull is definitely up there. Mm-hmm. I'd say also using extensive short coupling plyometrics, so really short ground contact time, but only doing them extensively, so sub-maximally. Mm-hmm. Before playing around with that for the first time, I thought that you would need to be doing intensive plyometrics to improve certain KPIs. Mm-hmm. At least that was my thought process at the time, until I went through a cycle of purely extensive, so sub-maximally by nature, short coupling plyometrics barefoot. And I want to say I did that for 4 months, and none of it was intensive. Like literally none of it was maximal effort. It was very repetitive in nature, but a lot of different variations. And I remember just by accident, I retested my RSI off a drop jump, and off every height, they significantly improved. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. And then, looking back, then I tried to reference back, right? Like bottom up kind of approach. I was like, okay, I saw this. And then I tried to see where could that be? And then looking at some of Yoeri Verkhoshansky's stuff. I remember Natalia Verkhoshansky gave a presentation, and I don't know if it was her or someone who described or spoke about the presentation. But it was said that probably the results that could be gained from stuff such as drop jumping could also be done with much less or much smaller impact short coupling exercises. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, it makes sense. I've experienced the same thing. And I think that's really the case. And since then I haven't been able to prove it yet. Mm-hmm. I haven't been able to prove it in the sense that I can't just have athletes just do extensive short coupling plyometrics. Like there's so many different things. So even if someone's RSI goes up, I still can't say, oh, was that got them there. Mm-hmm. But my hunch is that is probably the way to go, is to go into more extensive, so sub-maximal based exercises for short coupling plyometrics. While I think that the longer coupling ones are probably going to be or need a little bit more higher intensity variations.
Yeah,
that's probably one of the bigger things for me.
It's really interesting. I did something similar the first year when I started with the physical preparation of the rugby team that I work with, and essentially just introduced, 5 minutes of extensive plyos, just power speed drills at the end of every warm up, leading into the speed work that we were doing. So really, really nothing, groundbreaking. The most basic, your A skips and your snaps and your booms and all those things. And 6 months later, the sports coach comes to me and he's like, Sean, my front rowers are super explosive and dynamic. Like, what special exercise have you been doing with them? I'm like, we've just been doing like 10 minutes per week of extensive plyos for 6 months. That's all. And he was like, what? You didn't really get it. I think he still doesn't get it, but it is, sometimes it is that simple. And it's cool to see that a tool that is, a tool that is literally not costly, especially, from a physical standpoint, from a physiological standpoint, especially for trained athletes, it's a very low cost for pretty substantial returns, like you said, on that investment. And it's always good to see, people gravitate to those instead of just going for the, big flashy ones that obviously have their training effect, but come with a lot of, you have to just be careful how you use those because they can do more damage too, right?
Yeah. I mean, if I can get the same results in lower limb stiffness from some repeated hops and some reverse drop jumps versus real intensive drop jumping, if I can get the same results, but I minimize the risk, like why wouldn't I do that?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So you've talked in previous podcasts about the fact that you like to read literature, read research papers. Here I go. Can you talk a little bit about how you go into those papers? I mean, we talk a lot about, reading the literature, but there's obviously, it's not as easy as, hey, just pull the paper up and read it. You need to understand, methodology, and then how a bit of statistics and how they actually interpret the results. Because obviously, depending on what angle you take on the analysis, you can essentially pull out any fucking result that you want if you want to. So how do you go through the process of reading those papers and parsing out what actually brings something to the table or not?
I think, first of all, I think there's a lot of knowledge we can gather from research papers, but I think the more we want to gain from them, the more we need to understand their inherent downsides. Mm-hmm. So what's the problem with a lot of these research papers is they are often lab problems that are supposed to solve real world issues, right? So if I have, lab solutions to real world problems. So if I do a study, and it can be as controlled as possible, but I do it with 50 college students that have 3 weeks of strength training experience, and from there I am able to conclude that the PAP effect, it works for explosiveness improvements, then does that really transfer to a group of elite soccer players? I mean, it might hint towards it, but does that mean that it really is going to transfer to my specific situation? So I think the big thing is, if you're looking at scientific data, or if you're looking at research papers, that you understand its possible downsides mostly. All right. So there's so many differences between the situations of the paper, the environment that the researchers were in versus the environment that you find yourself in. If you understand that difference, you take that seriously, then you're probably going to get a lot more out of it, because you're going to understand that, it just might not apply. So I think that's one of the bigger things there, is understand its inherent downsides, and also discuss it with other people, right? Discuss the entire paper with other people, preferably the ones that are very good at maybe what you lack. So if you are not good at interpreting data, I'm really not that good at the data stuff. I'm good at transferring the conclusion of a study to my practical situation, but I'm not really good with data. But I do have people around me that are good with data, so I discuss it with them, and they're able to help me there, while I may be able to help them somewhere else.
For coaches that are listening and maybe who don't have the luxury of having a team of, qualified was the word that I was going to use, but that's not really the right term. People that know their shit around you and that you can bounce ideas off of and actually get something out of the conversation. So for maybe coaches that, coach alone and don't have anybody around them, how would you recommend that they go out and seek out those kind of, set up a round table once in a while with some coaches from the areas? Would you have any advice on that?
Yeah, I think primarily that should develop organically. I think sometimes people try to force their network, and I understand, your network is your net worth. So everyone wants to kind of invest in the people, especially that are perceived as higher than you.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it needs to develop organically, preferably people either slightly below your average, or below your level where you have to explain things, or
Mm-hmm.
someone that is slightly above your level that has to explain you things, or people at your level where you can really get into some deeper discussions.
Mm-hmm.
But if your roundtable consists of people that are very far below your own knowledge level, then it's going to be hard to discuss or teach them anything, and that you still gain something from it. While if they are much higher than you, then there's also too much of a gap to kind of be able to relate, right? So if I would have any advice there, is try to find people that are roughly in similar situations as you, and they don't have to live close. They can live as far as possible, far away from you on the other side of the world, if need be, because social media and Zoom calls and Microsoft Teams makes everything possible these days.
Mm-hmm.
So you are going to be able to find like-minded people, but you have to put yourself out there and also have other people, or have it available to other people, what kind of your level of thinking is, right? So maybe you put stuff out on social media and you reach out to other people with questions, discussion points, etc., and that kind of naturally grows into what could be perceived as a back and forth about certain topics. So I think a good example for me is Jay DeMayo. So that's CVASPs. I remember probably a year and a half or 2 years ago, I constantly bothered him with annoying ass questions about plyometrics, because Natalia Verkhoshansky did her presentation at CVASPs a lot of years ago already, beginning 2010 somewhere, I think. So I consistently was asking him questions about some of the stuff from the research, and I'm sure he found me annoying as heck in the beginning. But that got into some really cool and interesting discussions, and he really made me think about certain things, and that developed over the previous 2 years, to where I really rely on him now if I have certain things that I am unsure about. So, it doesn't matter where they live. It could be on the other side of the world, but you got to put yourself out there.